Welcome to another episode of Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, where certified financial planner Lauren Sherman shares thoughts on having a healthy mind, body, and spirit, an abundance of wealth inside portfolios and out, and lessons learned from clients and mentors over the years.
Welcome back for another Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement. I know we have had a little bit of a break from the show, but I'm excited to share this conversation with you as I'm joined by Neil Wilding to discuss the upcoming election, our country's budget obligations, and how taxes fit into this election and beyond. As a reminder, this episode is available in video format, so check that out at YouTube if you would like to watch. Because this one is timely with our upcoming election, we are not going to break it into a part 1 and part 2 like we have in the past, so this will be a bit of a marathon episode. Break it up into a few listens if you need to, but you won't want to miss this one, and we'll make it worth your time if you stick to the end. Before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the topics that we cover so you can keep an eye out for what to listen for. Or keep an ear out, I guess I should say. After I introduce Neil, we start off by talking about tax risk, and not just tax risk as in taxes might go up, taxes might go down, but within the framework of our government's budgetary obligations. As you listen, pay particular attention to the figures that make up what Neil refers to as mandatory spending, which major contributors include Social Security, Medicare, and interest on our debt. We then move into a conversation about discretionary spending, which is where almost all of the political differences are discussed between the parties. I won't jump ahead and ruin the surprise here, but as you listen, see if you can catch the obvious math problem our country has on its hands, and what this likely means for future tax rates. After talking about mandatory and discretionary spending, we go on to talk about what we refer to as legislative risk. We talk about what legislative risk is and some of the ways that it could affect you. Listen closely to the term step up in basis as we talk about how politicians view this as a potential goldmine for future tax revenue. From there, we ask the question, what does Congress do with ideas that do not get passed into law? Neil explains how once introduced, no bill is completely dead. We then move into another question. What would our deficit look like if we taxed every dollar of income over $500,000 at 100%? So anything above $500,000, the government keeps all of it and applies it to the deficit. I think it's an interesting conversation, but as a spoiler alert, this doesn't solve the issue either. What it actually could mean is that an increase in taxes is coming for everyone, not just those making north of $400,000, as politicians often like to claim. This may be a good point to take a break, but if you are powering right through, we next talk about Medicare IRMA and what I refer to as different tax planning windows. We also talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What is it? Is it going to go by the wayside? Which, for those who don't know what that means, it means that income tax rates would revert back to pre-2017 rates, which means higher taxes for the majority of Americans. Next, Neil shares his thoughts on legislative risk and why this risk doesn't go away even if the candidate you support wins the nomination. And as we wrap up, we talk about a Roth conversion strategy to shift some of your retirement funds from one bucket to another, as I like to say, which can help lower your tax variance or lower the unpredictability of your taxes in the future. I know that's a long introduction, but I want to give you a high-level overview first, which will hopefully give you a few main points to listen for during our conversation. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Neil Wilding. Neil, first off, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the show.
Lauren, really appreciate the invite and happy to be here.
So I'm going to give them a quick background just for our listeners about you. So Neil is Chief Operations Officer for Stonewood Financial. He is also the co-author of the industry-leading books titled The No Compromise Retirement Plan, The New Rules of Retirement Saving, and finally, The New Holistic Retirement. Neil holds a Bachelor of Science in Marketing from the University of Louisville. And then one last bit of information about Neil. He's a member of the National Baseball Coaches Association. So, Neil, I didn't know that last little piece about you before when we talked.
Yeah, well, I've my son is a big baseball player, and so I've coached him throughout his travel baseball career. So if you'd like to take this interview down the path of baseball coaching, I'm certainly happy to go there.
Sure, sure. And you and your family live in Louisville. It's you and how many kids?
Yeah, so my wife and I have three kids.
Okay.
So I have two daughters, one that just graduated from the University of Kentucky. And then my middle daughter is a sophomore at University of Kentucky. And then my son, the baseball player, just turned 16. So he's a sophomore in high school.
Okay. So some fun ages, and you're getting to experience, maybe live vicariously through them with the sports piece of it at least.
Yeah, yeah, you're never a fan. You're never a real fan until you have a child that plays youth sports, I tell you.
Sure. Sure. So we have a lot of different directions that we could take this conversation. So I'll try to steer the ship as well as we can. But first off, Neil is just here to tell us who's going to win the election, right?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and it could go a lot of different, a couple different ways for sure. But
Yeah, I
I
give you
think
a hard
instead,
time
let's
about
talk
that. Maybe
about
we'll
what it
have to have
means.
you back after the election and see if everything came true. But to kind of give a 10,000-foot view, I'll give a little bit of a kind of start here with something that we do at our firm. So at Integrity Wealth Management, we have something that we offer all of our clients. Well, it's actually free to everybody who is not a client, too. We call it retirement risks analysis. And it's for people who want to check out our firm, get a little bit better feel for the process that we go through. And really, the purpose of this, it's just a one-page front and back. It's color coordinated, so it's super simple where people don't have to look at 50-page report or something like that. You can quickly glance at it and get a feel for where your plan's strengths and weaknesses are at. But where I'm going with this is that there are 14 different risks that we review in that piece. And one of them that we call is tax risk. Now, you may define that a little bit differently than we do at our firm. So I'm curious if that's a good place for you to start.
Sure.
Tax risk, what is it and why is it important?
I just look at tax risk is just the risk that your taxes change in retirement, and those tax changes have a negative impact or potential to have a negative impact on your after-tax retirement income. In my career, I've always looked at our industry, and I always felt it was just important to make sure that savers are built to mitigate risk and ultimately make sure we don't lose money, right? And so I'm sure we look at ways to where we look at the market and make sure we're not, losing money based on how we, place our money. Um, you know, I'm sure we have income strategies to make sure that we have a nice, predictable paycheck in retirement. And if we don't have that, we can lose money. But then we start to look at taxes, and that becomes like this emerging risk because obviously, if tax policy changes between now and the time that we access our money, that represents change, right? And that represents uncertainty. And
Sure.
anytime we have uncertainty, it represents risk, and then of course the potential to lose money. And so that's why that's where tax risk and the discussion around tax risk really comes first and foremost when you start to you mentioned the election and politicians, they're talking about all the spending that they plan to do. That obviously comes on the other side of those spending discussions come taxing
Right.
discussions, and
Right.
that's where this risk kind of comes from.
So something I found really interesting, let me know if I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but um, the number I think that you or maybe your business partner Becky has talked about in the past is that we have a tax revenue of 4.4 trillion each year. Is that right? Am I
Yeah,
getting the
that
number right there?
4.4 trillion comes from the fiscal year 2023. So the
Okay.
Congressional Budget Office puts out numbers, and
Okay.
yeah, 4.4 trillion tax revenue.
Okay. And then what's interesting, the next point is that we also have obligations that we have to pay for. So there's kind of two line items or two different categories, I guess you could say, that you would put our obligations into. The first would be pretty cut and dry spending obligations that we don't have much leeway for. The president, Congress can't adjust these numbers. It's just current law. And from what I understand, that figure that pays for all of our obligations is also the 4.4 trillion number as well.
Yeah, you stop there, we have a balanced budget.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
before we even get into a conversation about spending $1 of everything that politicians argue about, we're already, quote unquote, maxed out right out the gate.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, we kind of call that mandatory spending, right? And it's
Okay.
before anything is, gavelled into law. The majority of that is, there's really three pieces of it. The first two kind of lumped together with Social Security and Medicare. And those are the two drivers of $3.8 trillion worth of mandatory spending that has to happen. The law's
Okay.
already set, that money is going to be spent, right? So that, and then the other part of that, another, just 0.6 trillion, just, less than one, right? But it's crazy how we throw trillions around. That's $600 billion. But 0.6 trillion comes from servicing the national debt, right? Just paying interest on the debt is another 0.6 trillion. So when you put those two line items together, which has to happen
Right.
before we spend anything on roads, military, anything like that, we've got 4.4 trillion spent out the door.
Yeah, we become a little bit numb to those figures, don't we? Because billion and trillion sound so similar that you can almost, I think all the money going to this or that or this bill. I think Americans have become a little bit numb to it.
It's no question, no question. But the taxes that have to happen on the other side of that, we certainly won't be numb to, right? Those are going to smack us in the face, and
Sure, that's
that's
a good
why it's a
point.
risk, and it's certainly it's why it's worth the discussion we're having today.
Yeah. The first two being Social Security and Medicare that go into that mandatory spending. I don't think any politician's going to talk about cuts to those because that probably means cuts to their voters as well. But that third one is kind of interesting, the interest being paid on the debt that we have. What does it mean, if anything, when interest rates go up or down to that interest on the debt that we're paying?
Well, I mean, it has a little, certainly has a little bit of an impact, right? But I think long-term projections, which is where, those a lot of this debt was already purchased at previous
Yeah, they're
rates, right?
long-term vehicles
Yeah,
for the
this
debt.
long-term vehicles. So that number is, even though interest rates kind of swing, that number doesn't change as much as you might think it would.
Okay,
But of course, the problem is we keep adding to it, right? And
sure.
so as the debt grows, naturally, even if rates went down a little bit, like, we've seen that a little bit, but even if rates were to go down a little, the fact that we keep adding trillions of dollars to it, that the service to that debt, it only gets worse.
Right. Yeah, if you really want to become depressed, what's that website where you can pull it up and track what the debt is and you just see the number keep ticking up and up and up?
It just goes
I don't
so
recommend that
quickly.
for anybody.
No, it's not. It doesn't do anybody any good to look at it, right?
And what's it at now? Is it 36?
Yeah, we're pushing like 36 trillion. And it's like every time you hit reset on your page, we have some data that we publish, and it's like before we get the data published, the number has changed significantly by
Right,
trillions. It's like we're going back and resetting that data all the time. It's a scary
right,
number, right? And it's certainly not getting better, right? Because when you look at the mandatory spending that we've talked about, that those are tied to Social Security and Medicare. Like, we have more Americans than ever reaching ages where they're going to be accessing those benefits.
right,
And so that demographic is not getting better, right? That number is not getting better. The more the debt grows, the more we have to service that. So the interest number not getting better, right? And then you have the other part of it, which we hadn't even started to talk about yet, which is the discretionary spending part of it.
yeah. So before we even get to the discretionary spending, just to kind of reiterate, every last dollar of that 4.4 trillion in tax dollars that's coming in is
Yeah.
gone out the door. So we're, like you said, we're at budget neutral right now, but we haven't got into the discretionary
We
spending.
haven't paid a dime to protect the country. We haven't paid a dime to the
Right.
roads. We haven't paid a dime for any of the things, any of the ideas that politicians come to the table with. That they may be great ideas, but obviously there's spending
Yeah.
that comes with it.
Yeah, and it's always hard to run, I think, on a fiscally responsible or conservative platform. That's not a super popular approach because people want to hear what can you do for me, not what programs can you cut.
I know it's like eating your vegetables, right? You know it's a good idea, but it's hard to do. Sometimes they don't taste that good.
Sure, sure.
So yeah.
So what all goes into when we're looking at the discretionary, that adds another, if I remember right, is it like 1.6, 1.7 trillion or so on top of that 4.4 number?
Yeah, well, in fiscal year 2023, yeah, it was another 1.7 trillion
Okay.
dollars worth of spending to do all of the things that we're talking about, right? And so it's so when you look at it, the trillions being added to the debt, that's where that comes from, right? If we've got a balanced budget before that happens, every dollar of spending. And so, yeah, 2023, it was 1.7 trillion. So total spending 6.1 when you add up all of that together, right? So you would think a $4.4 trillion revenue base would be plenty to work with.
Hmm.
But it's just not. And like you said, the discretionary stuff, it's not popular as a politician to come in and say, hey, I got some great ideas. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to spend any money. Right. So
Right.
everyone, regardless of party, has ideas. They have initiatives. They have things that they want to take care of in their term. They need it, right, for their baseball card, right? You got to have the stats. And so
Right.
uh, so it's what it's going to be part of it. We're always going to have that, right? And so when you start to look at those line items, right, the mandatory spending around Social Security and Medicare, service to the debt, and then the initiatives that the politicians bring to the table when elected,
Yeah.
very little of that is going to change. And so that's, I imagine, where the conversation is then going, is that what can change? What is the one thing that can change?
Right.
And it's the revenue side of the equation. If we are looking at 4.4 trillion and we're spending 6.1, uh, well, the 4.4 side of that is probably the area that can be addressed.
Yeah, I remember Becky saying something that stuck with me that we don't necessarily have a Republican or a Democrat problem. It's more of a math problem that we're dealing with.
It very
And
much is, and it's
yeah,
simple math, addition and subtraction, right?
it feels like, I guess, not to make it political, but it feels like, so we're, both parties are a little bit racing towards the proverbial cliff with the spending, maybe one a little bit quicker than the other, but
For sure.
neither party is fully putting on the brakes or turning the car around, maybe just slowing it down a bit,
Right.
but both parties, the spending is an issue, but like we're finding out through this conversation, that's kind of the secondary problem because we're only talking about the non-discretionary on top of our mandatory obligations.
Yeah, not only is it a math problem, but it's a demographics problem, which I guess demographics is also math, right? But that's the other part of it, is that we have so many people aging into needing the benefits that are already written into law, right? So,
Right.
so clearly we have to find other ways and we're not even talking about balancing the budget, right? But at least getting the numbers a little bit closer,
Sure.
so just to um, at least be solvent, right? That's a scary word, but yeah.
When was the last time? I don't know if you know this off the top of
I
your
don't.
head, but that we even had a balanced budget. If
Yeah, see, this is where I show my lack of experience on this kind of stuff, right? My colleague Becky, I'm sure, who worked in the White House, worked on Capitol Hill, and saw policy like this, she could probably answer that question.
I
So
I thought it was back even in the 90s that we had more of a balanced budget. That I remember they talked about that a lot. I wasn't
yeah,
very politically involved until maybe the late 90s,
yeah,
um, but the challenge too is that the problem gets bigger and bigger because the debt interest payment gets larger and larger for each new president that comes into office, as does a lot of the discretionary spending. Because, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it always feels like when we add a new program or there's new legislation passed, it always feels very difficult that we're peeling that back once it's in place. It doesn't feel like too often that the we're always fighting over new spending, but it feels like there's just kind of a belief that, okay, if the spending's already there, we're not touching that.
Well, right. And then also when they come up with ideas, a lot of times they're out of need. When you look at some of the things that have driven, like chunks of spending, you look back at COVID, right? It's clearly that was
Sure.
happening. You look at the financial crisis, we had to do a lot of spending in those situations. And those are, times of need, right? It's
Sure.
hard to say, so we needed some of that spending. And you look back to 2021, and you look at, President Biden was talking about, if September 2021, he introduced, it was the first time he mentioned something called Build Back Better. Do you remember Build Back
Yeah.
Better?
Yeah. I think I remember, I think we may have done a podcast on that back
Yeah.
then. They had a few, or maybe it was the Inflation Reduction Out. There's a few of them, but
Well, Build Back Better actually became the Inflation
that's
Reduction
right.
Act, which of course, they later admitted, like, okay, had nothing to do with reducing inflation.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but
It
Build Back
had quite the
Better,
opposite effect.
that's right. That's right. But Build Back Better, that it was, to me, it represented a time where, coming out of COVID, and they had all of these initiatives, at least on the Democratic Party side, that they wanted to cover. And then I think it was like $3.4 trillion worth of spending that were in that package. Now, keep in mind, not all of that stuff was passed into law, but those were the ideas. And even
Yeah.
that, they had massive tax reform to offset that number. But even that, it was like 2.7 trillion worth of new taxes. So even adding in,
Sure.
so again, this was just, Build Back Better was like I said, it wasn't passed into law, but even in its ideation phases, it introduced $2.7 trillion worth of new taxes. And we can talk about some of the areas where those were going to be kind of targeted, those taxes. But the fact is, it still didn't balance it off. They still didn't have enough tax revenue just to offset the ideas that they had. And so that's the
Right.
challenge is, every time they come up with new ideas, and a lot of times it is in a time of need, they have to come up with taxes to offset it. And,
Right.
and it's really hard to find, um, you know, um, enough tax revenue to offset some of the ideas that are out there.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's I forget the word for this concept, but I've heard Vivek Ramaswamy talk about starting at zero. Is It's probably zero balance budgeting or something like that, where you start
Yeah,
at zero and then you add the programs in. I
right.
suppose the challenge with that is that once something becomes like definitively a good idea, then you're having to kind of resell that idea every year or every couple of years, but which may be a little time consuming and red tapey, kind of unnecessary. But at the same time, I mean, we got to do something dramatically different, I would think.
Well, and that's where I think that we introduced this. We talked about tax risk at the top of the conversation,
Right.
and I like to expand. Like, tax risk is the risk that my taxes are different, right? That could be situational. It could just mean that I was married filing joint, and now I'm, single filing, and that changes my tax status. Suddenly, I'm
Sure.
in a different tax situation. But I like to think about a term called legislative risk, which is an extension of tax risk. And that's
Okay.
the risk that Congress changes the rules. It's not my situation. I'm in the same situation I was, yesterday that I am today, but suddenly there are new rules, and we're subject to those new rules. And that we call legislative risk. And so, when we start thinking about threats or situations or risks that could cause our clients to lose money, this becomes another one, right? Because if Congress decides, oh man, we've got all of this spending and these ideas that we need to fund, and maybe retirement assets. You got this whole pool of money that people have been deferring taxes to the future, of
Right.
money in IRAs and 401ks, which is just a massive, I think that number is north of 35 trillion dollars right now, of assets that have not been taxed. Oh, they start to see, that's an area where maybe we
Right.
can change the rules on to start generating some additional tax revenue to offset, the new spending ideas we have.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Same way with is it long-term capital gains or step up in basis perhaps? Was
Yeah.
that one of the ideas that they had to get
Well,
potentially get
that's
rid of?
fresh. Those are in the headlines now. So, not just your IRA money, but even your non-qualified money. One of the big benefits to owning a stock right now is that you get that step up in basis at death. Well, that's a rule they could change at any point, and that's on the
Yeah.
table right now. Some changes to that. That's legislative risk.
Well, and in
Maybe a
Iowa,
help.
one of the popular ways we see that happen a lot of times is with farmland,
Mm,
where
mhm.
people buy farmland way back in the day for $500 an acre, and now they can sell it for 20,000 an acre.
Right.
So that's a huge tax if they sell it while living. But if they pass away and pass it to the next generation, they're able to keep the farm in the family because essentially the kind of the fancy term is step up in basis. But that means is that whoever inherits those funds, whether it's a stock or farmland, does not pay taxes on that huge gain. And now they inherit it with as if it always cost that what it does today. Is that, uh, I don't know, that's
Right.
kind of a
Yeah.
chopped together explanation of how that works.
No, it is. It's absolutely how it works, and it's a huge benefit. But that is when you see a country where the revenue is not keeping up with the spending, and they need to fill that gap, and they see all of that unrealized, untaxed um, profit, if you call it, right, or
Right.
assets, man, they've got like a red bullseye on them now. And that's where we have risk. Now, am I saying that's going to happen? No, no, but the fact that it could happen is reason to just kind of consider how our
Yeah.
portfolios are allocated, and see if we can't maybe diversify, our retirement assets and
Yeah.
maybe our overall portfolio to account
The
for it.
fact that it's even a conversation topic is a little scary because
Yeah,
I think a lot of times the way they introduce those bills is, oh, this is only going to touch people with 100 million or more in assets. And then very quickly, if they can kind of get it their foot in the door once that bill's passed, very quickly they can start to say, well, why not drop this to 10 million? Or,
that's
who
right.
knows, why not drop this to 1 million?
Yeah, they say that in Washington, the hardest thing to do is to get a bill initially passed,
Sure.
but it's very easy to change the levels,
That
right?
makes
So
sense because who would be against taxing people with 100 million plus? Nobody needs that many assets would be the talking point, and
that's
then
right.
very quickly it becomes something that's hitting home in your own pocketbook.
Yeah, we saw that too. Like I mentioned that Build Back Better. I know it's been a couple of years, but with that, when he introduced that concept with Build Back Better, one of the taxes that he introduced, and again, it wasn't passed, but just the fact that it's out there represents some risk, was a new required minimum distribution on IRA assets. But what happened was they said, "Oh, don't worry, we're just going to set this number at a real high level, like $10 million more." Like nobody's got IRAs more than $10 million, except Mitt Romney, right? But but they set it at this real high level. Well, just even within the conversation, it went from 10 million to 8 million to 6 million. And so you could just see their minds working like, okay, let's get this
Yeah,
out there. And that was just I say just, it was a required minimum distribution they were going to put on IRAs. That meant that, if you did the responsible thing by putting money away in an IRA and you happen to do well and it grew to a point that the government's going to define, they're going to say you're no longer being responsible. Now you're greedy. And instead of giving you a tax benefit, we're going to hit you with like a required distribution. So then you're going to have to
right.
pay that tax now. Now, those are all details that don't matter much because that law wasn't passed. But one of the things that I've learned is that these ideas and concepts and bills, once introduced and priced through the process that like they went through with Build Back Better, those ideas never die.
Yeah.
So even if those laws are passed and the initiatives weren't incorporated in the ultimate bill, they don't die. They just go on the shelf for future
Hmm.
use. And they've already been priced. So and there's actually a real shelf. You might be thinking like, oh, it's like a book. No, there's an actual book, and there's 2 volumes of it that Congress has. And it's basically these ideas that they've had that were not actually passed into law. And they all are the idea, the concept, but also the pricing and the economic work that they did with it. And so if they've
Interesting.
got a $700 million spending initiative or $1 billion spending initiative, they just go and go into the book and say, okay, which idea should we pull off the shelf here to use? And that
Right.
RMD idea that I told you about, that was 2021 when it first came up. Guess what was in Biden's budget talks when he was this was a couple of months ago. It was before he stepped down from the election, but he was talking about his budget for 2025, and sure enough, he pulled that RMD idea on IRA assets off the shelf and started
Right.
dusting it off and say, oh, maybe that should be in some of the tax policy for 2025. Again, it still wasn't passed,
Yeah.
but again, it just kind of goes to show that these ideas are out there, and it just adds a level of uncertainty to the taxation of assets that haven't been taxed yet.
Right. Especially when they view those as a potential solution for the mess that we've gotten ourselves into. You just wish, this is oversimplifying things, but you just wish that our government would have to view the budget just the way that you and I and everybody else has to look at our own household budget. Is if you're making 100,000, you can't go out and spend 160 on the credit card and expect things to just be fine. It seems too obvious, but
Yeah, it
the
it
math
does.
doesn't math when it comes to the government for some reason.
I know. Well, and that's the hard thing is that all of these great ideas, if we really did balance the budget with all those ideas, taxation just have to look, they would be at uncomfortable levels, right?
Yeah.
Taxes would be at uncomfortable levels. And so the easy thing to do is ignore it and just let it roll into a debt that kick the can down the road and let someone else deal with it later. Scary, but that's what's happening.
Well, speaking of uncomfortable levels, one, I can't remember if it was you or Becky had mentioned, but the concept of if we taxed everybody at 100% tax, every single dollar of it, for people who are making, what was it, over $500,000,
Yeah,
every dollar amount over that $500,000 was taxed at 100%, that still wouldn't be enough to put
it
a
wouldn't be
dent,
enough.
a big enough,
No.
fix the deficit problem, I guess I
Yeah,
should
yeah, that was
say.
my colleague Becky that said that, and it was based on this number that you see out there. Uh, um, they say none of the tax initiatives, at least from the Democratic side, would affect anyone paying or making $400,000 or less.
Right, you do
And
hear that a lot.
yeah, you hear that a lot. And I don't think they're lying when they say that. I think they think they're being truthful, but the fact is it does impact so many people, so many more people than just people paying $400,000 or making $400,000 or more. But the challenge is in order for the numbers to get real, they would actually have to bring the taxation into people making $100,000 or less, and it's average American taxpayer, and just taxing the wealthy are not going to get us out of these problems. And I'm, that doesn't even tell you what side of the political aisle I'm on. That's just again back to that math problem that
Right.
you need more American taxpayers to contribute to the solution. And so now that doesn't mean that maybe their tax brackets, might not change, but there's other ways to
Right.
tax people and to generate revenue and come up with ideas outside of just a general tax bracket. And that's where I think more people will get impacted
Yeah,
or could get.
politicians can be a little sneaky when it comes to taxes because they don't want to have it in the headlines that they have new taxes, but there's a lot of other ways that they can raise tax revenue without directly adding a new tax or changing the brackets, it sounds like.
Yes, yes, and there are plenty of these like ideas on the shelf that we've talked about that are just that. It's not just as simple as, oh, instead of being in a 24% tax bracket, you'll go move to 28 or 29, right? That's one way,
Yeah.
but there's so many other ways. And that's why I think retirement assets, have a bullseye on them.
Yeah.
Because there can be different ways to tax, those. I think, there's just other, like, for example, Social Security, right? Like, it's taxed at an 85% level. They can change that, right?
Yeah.
It's,
I remember just because it was the year I was born, but 1983, Social Security was not taxed at all. And then they added it, I think 50% tax up to 50% at 93 or 83. And then what was it? 11 years later, they bumped it up to 85 where it's at
right.
now.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some different ways. Another way that hits home for a lot of my clients is the Medicare IRMA, income related monthly adjustment amount.
Yeah.
And
That
that's
that came to my
technically not a
mind too.
tax.
That
What's
came to
that?
my mind too, but I didn't say it just because I didn't know if you wanted to go to that level of detail, but it is a
Yeah.
great example of this. Yeah, sorry that I interrupted you.
Well, and that's a tough one too, because it's a, I guess they refer to it as a cliff tax, even though it's technically not a tax. But it's one of those where if you're, being $1 over in your tax bracket is not a big deal because it just means that last dollar is going to be taxed at a higher rate. But with Medicare, if you're $1 over, you're all the way over in that next bracket. It's kind of the image I try to put in my clients' heads to remember that is if you're running towards a cliff and you take one step too far, you're all the way over. You're not just a little over.
That's right. Yeah, it is. And it is, and so you start looking at, like Medicare being such a big line item in that mandatory spending number. That the challenge with that, we talk about legislative risk and passing new laws. This law's already passed, and those
Right.
IRMA, like the rates applied, the premiums that you have to pay, it's already written into law that those will go up every year. It's kind of like health insurance premiums, right? Where they do
Sure.
it based on experience. But those premiums go up every year since it's been around. I think the number is like 4.7, I think was the lowest increase they've ever had. The highest increase has been 8.02.
Hmm.
So you look at every year, those rates of IRMA are going up between 5 and 8%. And so and that's already written into law. The only thing that varies is actually what that percentage is.
Yeah.
So that is a direct, you're right, we can't call it a tax. So maybe we'll call it a government fee, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's it sure acts like a duck and quacking like a duck here. And that is a perfect example of of Congress changing the rules,
Yeah.
and finding a different way to increase revenue without calling it a tax.
Right. And not to get too into the weeds here, but one of the strategies, or I guess what we see a lot of times with people, is that let's call it, they retire at age 60. They have a handful of years before they're going to start Social Security. And then they have a handful of years after that until they have RMDs, the required minimum distributions, kick in for their IRA accounts. So we kind of have these planning windows, is what I call them. And sometimes people retire and then they love it. They say, my income went from this to this, and now I don't have to pay any taxes hardly. Um, but I try to challenge them a little bit and say, hey, let's make use of that and fill some of these lower brackets up with income by
Sure.
withdrawals that we're forcibly doing on our own, not because we're being told that we have to, that we're required to take those funds out, but because we want to fill those brackets up. Because I think too often what happens is people get, well, now age 73 or 75, depending on when you're born, but
I know.
traditionally, the magic number was 70 and a half, and
Yeah.
people would hit that number and they'd have to take these required distributions, and all of a sudden they'd be shot up into the higher brackets, and then you'd hit some of those, Medicare IRMA problems too. So
You do.
it's kind of
Yeah.
like a domino effect with some of this stuff.
That's right. I was doing the example for someone the other day. I think by age 81, just their required minimum distribution alone was going to push them up a tier in
Yeah.
IRMA, right? So that meant, and the challenge with IRMA is you jump one tier, it's not just for you, your spouse is also
Yeah.
purchasing, right? So it impacts two people. And it just starts to, it can snowball a little bit. And later on,
Yeah.
there's a second tier that you're jumping. So it certainly is an impact. And you're right. I like the way you kind of put that, where you have these windows of opportunity. Um, you know, like with Irma, if you're before, really the age that matters there is 63. So
Right.
if you're between, in that short window of like before retirement, you're not 63 yet, real opportunity to either take some money out of your retirement plan. I like to call it rebalancing. Really, it's kind of the same thing, right? You're just
Sure.
rebalancing the taxation of your assets, but to get some money over either to taxable or tax-free side. Um,
Yeah.
and then you also have the window before current tax policy sunsets. So you got some opportunity to do some tax planning there and reallocation. And then, like you said, yeah, before you hit those RMDs, there's another option there. So that's, you know, we find ourselves when you start talking about taxes and spending and the national debt, it makes you not feel so great. But the good news is there are things you can do about it. And that's why,
Yeah.
financial professionals like yourself know exactly what you're doing and create opportunities for your clients. So there's definitely opportunity to take advantage of, certain times and such.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's some of what we'll get into is here are the solutions, not just give everybody the bad news. But you're right. I think, yeah. And I'm big on visuals. I'll probably add a couple of PDFs to this podcast episode so that people can see some of this, but try to simplify things as much as possible because it can get pretty complex. But one of the visuals that I often use is, you show the three different tax buckets and you show kind of how full each bucket is for each individual client. And I think often what you're referring to in a lot of cases is tax diversification. And I think a lot of even financial advisors do a great job of diversifying assets from a kind of a pie chart
Yeah,
perspective with your assets, but they often don't do a great job. Even the advisors don't always do a great job of diversifying from a tax perspective. And I think if we can shift some of those assets from the tax deferred to a tax free bucket, that's pretty powerful because that does start to, at least it doesn't eliminate the tax risk or the legislative risk, but at least reduces it a little bit, where we have some flexibility and some options in the future of where we take income from. Because whether we like it or not, essentially all of our IRA money, which would be, your 401k, any of your retirement plans, you're in a partnership with our government, and we don't know how much of a cut they're going to want to take out of that when that
yeah.
time comes.
I know. Imagine being in a business and having a business partner, and that partner always gets to dictate their stake in the business. Like that's what we have here with the IRS. When you're deferring taxes to the future, it's like you're in a business relationship, and
Yeah.
Congress gets to pick their stake in your business. It's a good parallel there.
When you
Yeah,
use some of the analogies like that, it just sounds so ridiculous. It's like that analogy or talking about balancing your own budget in your own household. You
yeah,
just wish that our government would adopt some of these kind of common sense ideas. But
yeah.
um, I wanted to circle back to one thing that's probably pretty top of mind for a lot of people because you see it everywhere with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Hmm.
What's going to happen with that? Is it going to stick around? Is it going to go away? What is it exactly? How do we plan for it? Where do we start with that one?
Well, I think what you have is, it was passed into law in 2017. A lot of people call it the Trump taxes, um, but that policy sunsets here and at the end of tax year 2025, going into 2026. And so it'll take an act of Congress to change that, right? So what that probably means is that regardless of who's in office, those are probably going to sunset. Now, they might extend them or make some changes, but there's certainly the chance, high chance, I think, that those do get sunset, which means tax rates just revert
Yeah,
back to where they were in 2017. Um, and
which
and
is higher.
which is, yeah, significantly higher, right? So
Yeah,
tax rates since 2017 have been artificially low, right? We are talking about all the extra spending going on in Washington, yet just by because we had some policy from 2017, they're artificially low. So they will certainly, when they sunset, you're going to be up,
Yeah.
quite
Well,
a
and
bit.
I guess to interject kind of my own thoughts on that, it sounds like if Trump were to win, that he would extend them, but some of that's a little outside of his control. Whether he does it or not,
Right.
it's up to Congress at the end of the day.
Yeah. That's
Um,
right. People think about the presidential election, but all of
yeah.
the congressional elections going on, that's where policy is set.
Well, and I know Harris has said that she would basically let them sunset and expire. And what that means is that, circling back to what we were talking earlier about how taxes can go up, and this does affect a lot of people making well under 400K.
For sure.
So that's a way with that, she can raise taxes on a lot of people that are not making 400,000. But technically, once again, you kind of can use language to work your way around that. She's not really raising taxes. She's just letting the tax law expire as it's currently set into law.
That's right.
So once again, I think politicians can get a little creative there, but at the end of the day, it can be a little frustrating to your pocketbook if you find yourself paying all of those taxes and thinking that wasn't going to be the case.
Yeah, but to me, I think that key word again is could, right? Like, so because this could happen, it just represents uncertainty. And I think that's why the planning opportunity exists between now and then. Is
Sure.
you kind of likened it when we talked about diversification to the market. A lot of people fully believe in the market. I believe in the market. I'm sure you believe in the market. Like, we
Sure.
believe in the market, that over time, markets are efficient and they're going to do well, but they could go down. And the fact that they could go down, we have to create asset allocation models to mitigate against that risk. The same is true here with tax policy. We have a pretty strong belief on where taxes should go and could go, but just the fact that they could change represents risk.
Right.
And you mentioned the three buckets. Like, we're not also suggesting everything needs to be in one or the other. It's
Right.
just have a nice a diversified approach to the taxation of our assets, just in case some of this stuff does happen. If what could happen does happen, then we've got, we're positioned in a way to respond to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you did kind of an important piece there of bringing it back to maybe a little bit more macro, because we've been speaking a little bit more specifics. But at the end of the day, I think kind of part of the point of this too, and circling all the way back to when we were saying the budget's already there, the mandatory spending's already there, and we're going to be above and beyond that regardless of who's in office.
Yeah.
So I think at the end of the day, we're looking at a new election cycle every couple of years, and then every 4 years presidentially. So you've touched on this a little bit already, but what are some ways, bigger picture, that we can prepare for that? Because heck, if your president gets elected, that doesn't mean we're in the clear.
Right.
A lot of people are planning for a 20-30 year retirement, not the next 2 or 4 years or however long your person's in office.
Yeah, one of the phrases that I like to use in this conversation is, like, you might think that, when the election comes out, and if you're on a certain side, and you might think, oh man, I'm glad it worked out that way. I just barely dodged that bullet. And what we like to say is, when we're dealing with the retirement assets, we don't want to dodge bullets. Like, let's get the assets out of the line of fire so that regardless of what happens, we're in good shape. And so that comes with planning, right? And looking at the three buckets that you talked about, and it might mean moving some from one bucket to the other in a strategic way, like what you talked about, taking advantage of those windows, but just getting, kind of balancing out. And it's not because anyone's done anything wrong. I mean, when I started, went to work back, seems like the dark ages ago, right? I did the responsible thing. First thing I did is I filled out my health insurance, and then I started the 401k. And so
Sure.
that started my path during, to tax deferred savings. And then when I left that job, I rolled over that 401k into a new 401k, which is what we're supposed to do.
Right.
But what happens with that is that so many people do the responsible thing. It just means that a lot of people end up with more in the tax deferred bucket than the other two buckets. And
Right.
so that starts to happen, and you start to realize, oh, I'm a little overweight towards just this one. It's like being overweight towards one stock or having all your
Yeah.
money in one thing.
And that's the bucket that we have a relationship with the government where,
That's right.
using that analogy you said before with a business partner, we don't know how much they're going to take. So,
It's that bucket is when we talk about tax risk and legislative risk, it's the bucket that is most exposed to those things.
right.
And so, but we have opportunities to move some of those over. And that's where you look for the windows of opportunity to do just that. And just to even it out. We're not liquidating that bucket, but we're just
Yeah.
balancing out just because we ended up a little too much in one bucket. But it's a good thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
way, it's a great job. I mean,
Yeah.
better to have too much, right, than not
Yeah.
enough. But it's also, you have some opportunity then to kind of
Right.
reclassify how some of those assets are taxed.
Right. And I've found that with clients in years past, I've made the mistake of not doing a great job of explaining why we're reallocating some of these from one bucket to the other.
Hmm.
And in the short term, it's kind of painful because you're paying a lot more in taxes that year that you maybe do some of this tax planning, in a lot of cases, at least.
Yeah,
Um, so if you're trying to kind of shift assets from the tax deferred bucket into your tax free bucket, you can't do that without incurring a big tax bill in that year. So I've made the mistake of not talking about, hey, yes, it's going to hit us hard this year, but we're trying to lower what we refer to as your lifetime tax bill.
yeah.
And yeah, I think that is an important step. Otherwise, we have some clients that are a little frustrated of, I paid a lot more in taxes
It
this year than I
is.
did last year.
Yeah, it's some of it is a mindset, right? When you get your IRA statement and you see that there's, $750,000 in that statement, you think that's all yours. The
Mm,
challenge is that statement is a bit of an illusion because there is not a line item on that statement that says IRS or taxes,
right.
right? So when we think about the number that we should really be thinking about with our retirement assets is the after-tax number. And so, and if we're just thinking about the after-tax number, we're not really, well, I mean, I know we're scratching a check to the IRS, like we are paying taxes. That's the point, though.
Yeah.
But if we think about it from a after-tax value, that number doesn't change. You're basically just taking a debt,
Yeah.
like an IOU, and going ahead and paying that, and just letting the IRS have what's theirs. But now you bought them out, and now they're no longer part of your life,
That's a good way to
at least
put
for
it.
that portion of the money. And so when we think about it from an after-tax value, it's a little easier to stomach some of the taxes we have to pay in the short
Right.
term because we know it is going to be so much better beneficial for me in the long term.
Right. And Roth conversions, that term gets thrown around so much and it kind of becomes a popular thing. You see it on social media a lot and people talking
Hmm.
about it. And some people, it gets so popular that you might see people say, like, oh, I need to invest in those Roth conversions. Like they're doing really well right now or something, even though it's has
Yeah,
nothing to do what you're invested in. It's just the tax qualification of it.
that's
Um,
right. Yeah.
but I have seen, sometimes on the kind of the flip side of this is some people get a little too excited about Roth conversions and they start doing it when they're in their peak earning years before they retire. And it might not be a bad idea to still have some tax diversification at that point in your life, but also we have to think long term. And if we're a year away from retirement, maybe we want to wait a little bit until our income drops and we can pay those taxes at a much lower rate instead of when our income is much higher. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. It's just kind of anecdotally something I've seen people get excited about this
Mhm.
concept without knowing a whole lot about it.
Well, it's certainly something you want to do like you want to do it on your own, right? You want to be extremely strategic about it. You cannot just make a broad statement that everybody needs to convert 80% or whatever it is, right? It is certainly a client by client situation. In some
Mhm.
cases, it might make sense to go ahead and do some of that now if you really believe taxes are going to be significantly higher in the short term sure, might be okay to assume some tax drift, to go ahead and pay them now to avoid that huge, what you anticipate to be a huge tax jump. If you think it
Sure.
might be more moderate to where maybe the tax changes might happen over a series of time, then you have a little bit more time to convert, and maybe we can spread it out.
Right.
It's kind of like that risk tolerance. Like, what is your risk tolerance for this side of things? And if you're
Yeah.
really, really nervous about it, maybe it's okay to do some of it really quickly. But economically, it might make sense to kind of spread it out a little bit.
Yeah. Or at least do open an account and get it funded just with $1 so that you start your 5-year tax window,
You
which
definitely want to do
I
that.
think
Yep.
we may do a whole separate episode on that because that can get a little confusing. There's a little pre 59 and a half rules for post 59 and a half, but yeah, there's some rules that go along with it. And um, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I was going to mention related to that piece of it.
Well, and it's okay too to leave. Like, I don't think we need to convert all of our money. I mean, we've talked about diversification, but as long as you believe that you will have some sort of standard deduction, like now, standard deduction is a number that is subject to legislative risk, right? That number can go up or down, but as
Yeah.
long as there is a deduction, it might be okay to have some of our assets still in tax deferred. So that way we can strategically take out enough to where we're just getting up to that standard deduction, whatever that is.
Right.
So
Right.
it's okay to have some tax deferred money, but we just
Yeah.
don't want it all there.
Yeah. Another rule that comes along with the Roth conversions, just while it's top of mind, I'll mention that can be an issue is that you can't do a conversion and then just wait until April 15th the following year and pay the taxes on it. We got to go ahead and pay the taxes at the time of the conversion, or at least the quarter in which you do the conversion.
Right.
Otherwise, you can run into a little bit of an issue with that too. So,
Yeah.
just kind of adding to your point that it's not something you want to do haphazardly on your own. You got to really have a plan of attack with this.
Yeah. And I like to think of them as kind of self-contained solutions. So if we're going to look at like the economic impact, I want to look at, if we're going to convert a 500,000, I'm going to consider the taxes that we're going to pay in that conversion in that money.
Sure.
Better that than having to go find the tax money elsewhere. I think
Sure.
it's good to think of them in kind of, I use that term self-contained, where it's right there.
Yeah.
It's easier to kind of see the math play out. And again, that kind of goes to making sure you're working with someone that knows what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, we often try to pay the taxes from external accounts just because we think there's a little more efficiency that we can gain from that if clients have a taxable
Yeah.
account, but it is another step, and it takes a little additional explanation because it is a little
Yeah.
handy when it's more of just that all-in-one solution of the taxes are handled within the conversion and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, and part of it too is just like when we're thinking about the math behind it, the analysis, I like to consider it, the execution of it. Yeah, it might make sense to go take it from
Yeah.
somewhere else, but as long as we're thinking of that as the money that was there, I think it
Yeah,
helps
that's fair. That makes it
understand the logic behind the conversion, and so yeah.
right, right. Well, we're coming up on our time here. Time's kind of zipped right by with you. I'm going to take a
Yeah.
peek at my notes and see if there was anything else that I had that I really wanted to ask you about. But while I'm looking at my notes, was there anything in particular top of mind that we hadn't touched on yet?
Well, we
That
never got to travel baseball. We never got to, youth
yeah.
sports culture. So we could just spend, maybe that's the topic for the next
Wait,
podcast.
I gotta ask, so being in baseball, you have to, if you're gonna be the dad out in the stands, you have to at least umpire at some point too, so you know what it's like on that side of the fence too, right?
Well, I feel like I'm an umpire at every game I attend, whether I'm a coach or a fan, because I gotta, we always have the best angle possible of every pitch from the stands
Of
in the
course,
dugout, not the guy standing right behind home
of
plate, right?
course.
But no, you know what? It is one role in baseball I've not done. I have not donned the mask and the umpire gear. So
Yeah.
maybe that's next step. Let's get my son out and get him into college first, and then
Yeah,
we'll.
you don't want to be punching him out at the plate. You need
Or maybe I do, right? Maybe
conflict of interest there.
I
I did the little umpiring, but that's going way back in the day. But it's definitely a little humbling because yeah, everything looks easy when it's not you having to make the call.
I was one of the pillars of my coaching philosophy was to never allow a parent or a kid have any complaints of whatsoever of a call. We just because first off, you want the umpire to be your friend, right? And
Sure.
best way to win a call is to be nice to an umpire, not to yell at them. So I kind of took
Right.
that approach. But also it is a very difficult, it's, everything's happening so quickly. You have to be decisive and stick by it, regardless of whether you think you're right or not. It's tough. It's tough. It's why and also parents don't make it easy anymore. It's why, now, like when you're having playing youth tournaments and youth leagues and even high school games, it's hard to find enough umpires. Like we've had many games canceled because we don't have enough umpires.
Wow.
And it's because it's tough to do, and
Yeah,
people
I
aren't always
suppose.
nice.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And
Some,
ultimately, I mean, you never want to be the person every time just blaming the refs or blaming the umpire. Like you have to kind of live in that circle of what can you control. And
that's right.
hey, that circles back perfectly to our
There we
tax
go.
analogy. You got
There
to
you
live in
go.
that world of what can you control with taxes. And we
That's
can
right.
gripe about all we want, but at
Yeah,
the end of the day, it kind of is what it is. You can go out and vote and make your voice heard, but beyond that, you just kind of have to live with it and then plan accordingly. So,
that's right. Yeah, well done.
hey, that was kind of like as we were flying along, that just came to me. So,
Good
um,
deal.
well, yeah, I really appreciate you joining us, and I'm sure there's probably a bunch of topics that are going to flood my mind as soon as we end the call. That maybe we'll have to have you back on and cover some more topics. But
I'm happy to do it. I enjoy these conversations and appreciate working with you for
well, that's
sure.
cool because not everybody loves to sit here and talk about taxes and legislation and stuff like that. So I appreciate the conversation, and
You bet.
we'll go ahead and put a link to the books in the show notes if people want to check those out. Actually, we may even do a giveaway. In the past, we've done like 10 books giveaway. So I
Okay.
think we'll do that for this one as well. I'll put something there where people can get a free book if they'd like. So
Awesome.
um, yeah, I appreciate you joining me. For all of our listeners, you can go to our website, integrityguidance.com. Visit, let's see, it's just a podcast tab on the website for any previous podcast. And I've been a little bit missing from the podcast world here. I'm a little bit behind just because, the podcast sometimes takes, it's a little bit on the back burner when you have a bunch of client things that you're working on, but we try to get them out every 2 weeks. So hopefully we'll get back into that cadence, and we'll catch everyone in 2 weeks. And until then, God bless. Thanks, Neil.
You bet. Thanks.
Thank you for joining me for this extended version of another healthy, wealthy, and wise retirement. And a special thank you to Neil for sharing his wisdom with us. To wrap up with a couple of my own thoughts, we started out by discussing what was referred to as mandatory and discretionary spending. We did so with the assumption that mandatory spending cannot be touched, and it simply is what it is. That's largely because this is widely accepted, and many of the government programs that are now considered mandatory are thought of as untouchable. A wise political candidate once said, "We need to turn the bowl over and dump out the alphabet soup," referring to the fact that we have 464 government agencies. We just continue to add more and more government-run agencies that tend to be inefficient and have little to no accountability. And don't get me wrong, a lot of these agencies are made up of very good people, but they are good people who would thrive in an open market that is not funded by taxpayer dollars. I thought that was worth mentioning because as voters and informed citizens, we should be pushing back against the status quo rather than accepting that every dollar our government tells us is mandatory actually is so. Now, moving into my final say on the topic, if 1 hour with Neil wasn't enough and you'd like to learn more, we are giving away a handful of the book that Neil co-wrote called The New Holistic Retirement. This is a quick read that includes some easy to understand charts to help better illustrate some of what we talked about today. The principles in this book are helpful regardless of who wins this November, and if you'd like your own copy, just send an email to hello@integrityguidance and put holistic retirement in the subject line. You can find all of our past episodes at integrityguidance.com. And you can always reach out if you'd like to learn more about our firm. See you next time, and God bless.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, we would love if you took a quick moment to leave an honest review. Of course, we're shooting for 5 stars, but if you have suggestions to improve the show, we would love to hear from you too. Just click on the podcast name, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, and scroll down to ratings and review. Thanks again for your support, as this helps us reach a wider audience and help even more retirees just like you. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not intended as a specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Lauren Sherman is a certified financial planner and co-owner of Integrity Wealth Management, an investment advisor serving retirees in search of their own healthy, wealthy, and wise retirement lifestyle.